the thing that erodes trust the most in these organizations is when solutions teams feel like they're flat-footed in front of customers, right? And so I've seen scenarios where literally an SE is giving a demo and the product changed without them knowing, right? And it's like that's the worst, that's the nightmare scenario for an SE because again, going back to that credibility, it's like, wait a second, you're the product expert and you don't even know your product's updated.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Inventive podcast. Today I'm extremely excited to be chatting with Tejas Saraiya. Tejas is a highly accomplished leader in product and go-to-market roles. He was a VP of Solutions Engineering at UiPath and led the organization of 75 plus solutions engineer in the Americas. Prior to that, he was a VP of Customer Solutions and GM Design Systems Business at Envision. And before that, he held a variety of roles across customer engineering and product at Google. He's a UC Berkeley alumnus and received both his CS degree and his MBA from the school. Hey Tejas, welcome to the show. Really excited to be talking to you.
Hey Gaurav, very excited to be here. Thanks for the intro.
Awesome. So let's kick off at a high level, just trying to understand what your story has been and how did you get to where you are today. So you've had a very successful career from PayPal to Google to Envision to UiPath. Can you tell us about like what were the pivotal moments in your professional journey?
Yeah, I think I think throughout any career, like each of the decisions ends up being quite pivotal. You don't necessarily realize the impact at the time, but looking back on it, each one of those kind of job changes and internally at an organization or even into other companies is always quite formative or has been for me. I think like fundamentally what I've thought about in each of those is, and when I look back, it's been how do I go work on the most interesting kind of problem and where I can be building something that ultimately I can get excited about. And so that's kind of what guided me throughout all of those things. And I ended up doing pretty different roles in various points of my career. And I also found one of the patterns was I was drawn to things that were very early stage, like even within a bigger organization like Google and so forth. I was drawn to the part of Google that was very, very early. And
Hmm.
so kind of like high ambiguity, new initiatives, lots of things to go figure out. Um, and I'm kind of a nerd at heart, so like technology is always an important part of the equation. It's never been like technology for the sake of it, but it's like, hey, here's an interesting technology that can have a big business impact. How do I go work on that? Um, and then like the MBA, I did the MBA in the evenings and weekends, which definitely impacted a lot of things personally, but also just from a network standpoint, a local network standpoint, it's been a huge impact. A lot of my longtime friends are from that network, including Lorraine, one of the co-founders here, and ultimately that's been a formative thing. So that's a little bit of kind of how I look at that.
Awesome. Yeah. And I always admire people who are able to do their MBAs along with jobs. It's like doing two jobs at once because the B schools here are just crazy, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it's a little bit of a you have to want some pain.
Awesome. I want to dig a little bit deeper into your role as a solutions leader. So, can you maybe tell us a bit about what does your role as a solutions leader look like on a day-to-day basis, and if there is any way you can give us some examples?
Yeah. Yeah, so on a day-to-day basis, this is really, I think just fundamentally, I sort of subscribe to the servant leadership kind of idea where really I'm there to remove roadblocks for my team, both for my leaders and for the team members in the the larger organizations, and and then also creating the conditions for success for them, for the organization. And for me, that especially for solutions teams, that centers in psychological safety, which, like having grown up at Google, like psychological safety was a big concept, but for this role in particular, it's so critically important because you have to be able to say you don't know certain things, right? Like you can't possibly know everything there is to know about every question. And so for this role in particular, that's so important because it takes a long time to build customer trust and credibility, but it takes an instant to lose it. And for
Mm-hmm.
this job, that trusted advisor status is what we are there for. It's what we aspire to, both internally and externally. So I think, to me, that's a big part of it. Then there's all the, process stuff, right? How do I get the team to be able to work efficiently, focus on the right things? Um, in most organizations, the solutions team it is a sales job, and so there's a component here of like how do you keep people motivated on the right things? How do you align with all the right stakeholders? And then the last bit is like it's a customer first job, and so ultimately, like how do you, especially for the solutions teams, how do you understand where the customers could be doing more with the product, and
Mm-hmm.
that's customers and non-customers, right? But like, what are the gaps? What's holding them back from making a decision in your favor, or from deciding at all? Like, you see this all the time, right? The decision just dies on the vine. Why did that happen? And then also having a really tight feedback loop with product leadership, I think is super important. One of the things that I love about the solutions team is that it's one of the few teams, maybe the only team, that sees all the things where customers don't buy. It's like, what are all the use cases we didn't win? What are all the customers we didn't win, and why, right? And that's a gold mine, from a product standpoint. So those are some of the things I think about kind of on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just note down some very interesting points. I think you said something around like building trust over a period of time is
Hmm.
very like it's a a lot of hard work, but you can say something and you can lose trust of the customer. So it's actually very important to actually just be honest and say that, hey, yeah, I don't know this, and maybe like just come back. So like building that psychological safety, I think, is extremely critical as a leader.
Hmm. Yeah.
And the I guess the other point that like really hit home was the last thing that you mentioned, which is like you get to see what things people are not buying,
Hmm.
and it's such an important thing to relay that feedback to the product teams and drive that product vision and roadmap. So that's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on the point about the sort of like trusted advisor, it's not just external, like internally too. There's really important trust relationships between solutions teams and the account executives, right? They're your internal partner, and the moment that that person loses trust in their counterpart,
Hmm.
that's really
Yeah.
hard. And then also like with the product teams, like we said, like I have to be able to have a trusting relationship there so that I can provide the feedback and it's heard, with the right level of credibility. So I think there's so many aspects of that, like you really can't can't make stuff up, right? Because that's the worst possible thing you can feel like you have to do, and so it's much better to just say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. I know where to go find it, or even better, like, tell me why that's important to you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Just digging deeper on the customer engineering and solutions a bit more, like what are the top things that your team, like very tactically, is focused on, and any examples of go-to-market or pre-sales engineering solutions?
Mhm. Yeah, so I like pretty much these pre-sales organizations that I've led. I kind of have one mantra that I talk about, which is what I call bigger, faster, and healthier deals. And
Hmm.
so that really kind of encapsulates a few things. One is how do we show the art of the possible and grow the opportunities? Like how do we make it bigger? How do we get wider and higher in the account so that we can drive the process and hopefully also grow the pie? Um, and then how do we de-risk things? And so like that's just the kind of the healthier part of it.
Hmm.
And so how do we like ultimately we are the ground truth a lot of times for like this is how the customer is going to actually use the product. And if it doesn't, and we know that it's not going to work in the way that's intended, like that's a risk factor. Another big risk factor that often comes in is like people kind of kick the can down the road on security and compliance stuff. Like, oh, we'll figure that out towards the end of the process. And inevitably that derails.
Mm.
At the very best, it just delays the deal, and at worst, it completely derails the deal. And so, like, how do you bring topics like that are harder earlier? Which is, it can be a touchy subject, right? Because you don't want to take the deal down a path that is not going to be productive, but at the same time, you want to remove risk. Also, like end user or practitioner sentiment. Like a lot of the products I've sold have often had a developer component to them, and so we all know like if there's a top-down initiative and you're telling the developers that are practitioners they have to use a certain tool, that's probably not going to go over very well. And so you
Hmm.
need to sort of what I call win the hearts and minds of the practitioners. And that ultimately is usually the solutions team's responsibility, which goes back into that de-risking thing. So that's kind of some of the things I think about. And then when you ladder that up to the bigger business context, it's kind of like, okay, how do we then support the overall business success? Because at the end of the day, it's like I can run a great, you know, solution validation exercise, but like if that doesn't help me win the deal or help me get to my sales targets, then that doesn't really matter. And so, like, I think about, especially at a leadership level, I think about things like forecast accuracy. How do we inform the forecast? A simple example is like if I know there's deals that are in forecast that have a high degree of risk with them, like, hey, we haven't done a security review yet, as an example. That's something we should be talking about at a leadership level. Um, or the product feedback loop we talked about already. So important to bring that back into the organization. And then things like marketing support, right? Like SE teams tend to be very involved in marketing. We're the ones usually on the floor of the customer event, right? Running the booths, and we're doing webinars, and there's all this stuff that is really really important, that sometimes doesn't show up on an individual deal basis, but is important overall. So those are some of the things I think about kind of for the team.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Very cool. What are the biggest challenges that the pre-sales solutions engineering teams face, and any examples that you can share?
I think one of the biggest challenges and one of the kind of the mindset that I try to get for my teams and sometimes change within my teams is how to move from a more reactive to a more proactive posture. And what I mean by that is like partly that's often resource related, right? It's like, hey, we
Mm.
don't have enough resourcing to necessarily be involved early in all the deals, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense to be involved early in all the deals, but there's like account planning, there's territory planning, there's strategizing work that the SEs have such a unique perspective to bring to, but often are, for whatever reason, not part of those conversations. And so I think trying to encourage the team to get involved in that and sort of be proactive about bringing insights into the rest of the team is one. The second thing is like the SEs are in the middle of a lot of things often, and there's a lot of it's like marketing wants some of your time, and we need somebody to go
Mm-hmm.
do this executive briefing, right? And there's all kinds of different pulls on the time because of the knowledge that the team has, right? They're like they are talking to customers all the time, and they know about the products, and so people want them in those conversations. But ultimately, you have to prioritize, and what I like to say is like, how do you say no constructively? And this is like more philosophy, but it's kind of like the personality types that are drawn to this role are also the ones that have a hard time saying no to things. And so
Mm-hmm.
how do you, again, going back to the psychological safety topic, it's like how do you get people in a position where they feel like they're empowered to be able to say, you know what, that's not the best use of my time, but here are some resources that can be helpful to you, right? Um, and then the last bit I think is like as a leader, I definitely just constantly talking to other leaders and my peers. It's like how do you measure the impact? And it's really hard to measure the causation of the role because it's so intertwined in the sales process. So oftentimes we talk about correlation and ultimately like, hey, here's our outcomes with and without SEs involved, but making that case of like, hey, here's the actual dollar impact for what the organization is doing isn't always
Mm-hmm.
straightforward. Um, and then organizationally, like I think there's a couple things that patterns I've seen. One is that the SE job is an awesome job. It's a really fun job, but the career path is pretty it doesn't have a natural career progression, right? It's like, okay, I can be a more junior SE, I can be a more senior SE, but then what? Like, do I become
Mm-hmm.
an SE manager? Do I go into product management, product marketing? Do I go into sales? And so helping the team sort of map out what they want their careers to look like. And that oftentimes means that they're going to go into a different function. And I actually feel like that's success for an organization I'm leading, is like if people are sort of able to move into different functions and have an impact there, that's great. And the last bit is we definitely have challenges in terms of the diversity of the teams, and that was a big emphasis for me. Is how do we get more people who, um, maybe on paper don't have the traditional, like they didn't come from an SE role, but they have all the right ingredients. How do we get them in sort of the non-traditional backgrounds, and then ultimately, I think that just makes for a stronger organization.
Got it. Yeah, a lot of great points in there. I want to dig deeper specifically on, I think you mentioned about bringing the SEs early in
Mm,
the product development lifecycle. I think it's completely agree. It's so important because like a lot of companies have put the users first as a mantra, but like it's not well integrated, especially in like larger organizations. And I can totally see why SEs are so important because they are like hearing the customers in and out and understanding their problems.
mhm. Yeah.
um, Given your background in like product and solutions leadership, like how do you think companies should think about the relationship between solutions and product teams?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a topic. I'm really glad you asked this because I'm super passionate about this topic. And having been in both seats, right, leading product teams and leading these SE pre-sales teams, I like fundamentally, I think that the solutions teams should be product's best friend, like what you just said, right? There's so much knowledge and insight that the team has that product can use as they're formulating, the product strategy and maybe the next initiatives to go after and where to invest. So I think that should be a really um, tight coupling. But again, it also requires trust, as we talked about. And so I think one of the fears that product teams have, in my experience, is that there's like, hey, we don't want to involve the sales team because we don't want to overpromise to customers. We don't want information that isn't fully baked to kind of like leave the building. And I think that's where it's really important, where the solutions team can be that, they can be the sort of eyes and ears in the field without breaching that trust, right? And then that's critically important. So I like to say like sell what's on the truck, but ultimately like you also have to be able to paint a vision of what's where this is going, right? Because the customers are making a decision. They're not making a decision just about what they're buying now. They're making a decision, an investment decision over hopefully a longer period of time, right? And so they need to know what that longer term view is, but you have to do that in a way that's not over promising, and not selling futures. And so that's a really hard balance. Um, the second thing I think that's really important about this is it is a two-way street. So like SEs can bring feedback in and should be bringing feedback into the organization. We talked about that, right? They can see things that are happening in the field, but it's also really, really important for the SEs to communicate and represent the product vision and strategy and kind of some of the philosophy outward. And so an example of that is like oftentimes a customer will say, hey, we need feature X, right? We don't want to buy in. It's like the classic problem. We don't want to buy it unless you have this feature. And one approach is to say, hey, product, like we need to build this feature, right? The other the other approach is to say, well, product is like, hey, we've thought about that feature. We're actually not going to build that feature because that's the old way of doing things. We're actually going to build this other thing that's a better way of doing that. And now we need to then communicate that back to the customer, right? And that is, I think that's where it's really, when it's really working well, that's the type of sort of two-way street, um, that happens. And we talked about like SEs see the non-customers, they see the use cases we don't win, right? I think that's I think an undervalued and sometimes not tapped into potential. And actually, it's not even about we talk about competitive knowledge and competitive intelligence, great. Like we absolutely need to understand where we're losing to competitors, but oftentimes it's where we're losing to do nothing that is the most interesting, right? It's like why did the customer just decide they were going to do whatever they're still doing? So like what are the substitutes to what they would do with our product? Um, and so at the end of the day, like I think that is such an important pairing. When I'm leading either of those groups, that's one of the like that pairing is the one that I try to solidify the most, and build that trust between those organizations.
Got it. Yeah. I'm just curious, like this is something that we are trying to like this is a paradigm that we are trying to instill in Inventive as well at this point of time where we have the product vision and we have everything, but we want our sales teams and like solutions team to kind of have that very granular level understanding of what the vision is and like what is existing and what the vision is and so on. I'm just curious, like what like very tactically like what type of things have helped
Yeah.
your teams in the past to build this like stronger relationship between products and solutions teams.
Yeah. So a few tactics that, well, first off, I think the solutions teams are super hungry for that type of engagement, right? So I think that it's already like I think a very willing audience.
Hmm.
I think, so a couple things that we've done in the past that helped is one is like we started to get a little bit more specific about like how we capture feedback in the system. And like this, there's many tools to do this and various ways to do it, but it fundamentally boiled down to like first establishing that we're speaking the same language as product. And so what we
Hmm.
did was we would like build out sort of this taxonomy of the different categories and subcategories of topics. And they're not all, by the way, feature related, right? There's also like things like documentation is a topic, then, and things like what are some of the ways that the customer is going to onboard onto this product? That's a topic. And so we would try to like cap in collaboration with product to create that, right? um, and then start to capture that in a more systematic way on the solution side. And it goes by different names: product gaps, deal blockers, whatnot, but it's fundamentally the same concept. And then we had an established cadence with product where we would talk about those on a regular basis. And so that way there's an like it's not like I mean, there will definitely be escalations, but outside of the escalations, how do we go have a productive conversation about these things on a regular basis? Um, so that helped a lot. I think the other thing, I mean, it's going to sound sort of um, trivial, but like the communication of things that are upcoming, like I think the thing that erodes trust the most in these organizations is when solutions teams feel like they're flat-footed in front of customers, right? And so I've seen scenarios where literally an SE is giving a demo and the product changed without them knowing. And it's like that's the worst, that's a nightmare scenario for an SE because again, going back to that credibility, it's like, wait a second, you're the product expert and you don't even know your product's updated? Like,
Hmm.
and so and then if you like that's a sort of extreme scenario, but the more common scenario is just kind of being late in the cycle, hearing about upcoming changes is really hard. It's a hard place for the SEs to be because they are representing the product in the field, right? And so I think just improving that cycle time. And it doesn't have to be to the whole, I think this is the other part, like it doesn't have to be the whole go-to-market organization. It can just
Hmm.
be product communicating those things with the solutions teams. And again, that trust of like, hey, we're bringing you into the fold sooner, knowing that this is like we have a communication roadmap for how we want to talk about this.
Got it. Yeah, yeah, totally makes sense. For like, I hope that doesn't happen to our sales teams where we're presenting something and we push out a different release essentially.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to understand and dig a little deeper on the topic of RFPs and sales questionnaires. Like a lot of our listeners and users do RFPs and sales questionnaires. So I wanted to understand like what's been your experience with RFPs and sales questionnaires, and yeah, if you wanted to add anything on that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I mean, it's a super important part of not just what the solutions teams do, but really of the sales process in a lot of cases, right? And I think like there's a few flavors of RFPs or RFIs or like that whole um, sort of category of deliverable, which is some are like it's a very prescribed step in the process. It has a lot of rules around it, and it's like it's the customer is trying to put in place a very specific procurement process. And sometimes that is just like the customer is a big customer and they want to operate, but they have to operate with as much equitability as possible. In other cases, it's like a government entity and it actually is like the law. Um, and then in other cases, it's a much looser, like part of the process where the customer is doing it because they're trying to gather information in a more structured way, but you can influence that process a lot more. And so that's where, for the solutions teams, it's certainly like collaborating with the sales teams. It's like, how do you get into a position where you're influencing what the RFPs look like, um,
Mm.
and trying to shape that and use that as it becomes a sales tool essentially, right? It's like, hey, I'm helping to shape what the RFP is so that I can skew it in my favor and I can put in questions that are going to highlight things that I'm good at and also highlight my differentiators. And so that's how we often thought about an RFP. Like we used to say that if we were getting an RFP that we had no input into, that we were already too late. And so then
Mm.
then it becomes a question of how do you want to approach that. So yeah, RFPs are super important. I think also for the solutions teams in particular, we ought to be able to answer the vast majority of the RFP on our own and then go to the subject matter experts only for the things that are unique or different or maybe require another level of detail. And so, I think the work that you all are doing and the innovation that's happening here is really great because a lot of it can be repetitive, but a lot of it is an opportunity also to like highlight the differentiators and like answering your RFP questions in a certain way can actually put you in a good position. Um, and then I think that bigger companies like with RFPs, I think one thing that's often not obvious is that you may have partners, multiple partners that are answering the RFP. And so there's another layer of the RFP process, which is internally like how do you actually create a equitable process between your own partners? And so, we would have situations where like we'd assign an SE to work with each of those partners, but those SEs wouldn't be talking to each other about their RSP responses. But it's helpful to have a standard sort of repository where this is like the standard approved response, and then the partners can use those responses. Um, so that we make sure we're being consistent. But I really like the things that I've seen you guys doing around being able to tap into all these different knowledge sources and the integrations. I think that's so important because that information is scattered everywhere, and oftentimes it's like the conflicting information in multiple places that kind of going back to that credibility thing, right? It's like if I am providing information that's inconsistent, then that's gonna impact my credibility. Um, and I think some of the work around like there's a whole bunch of research steps that happen in RFP construction, um, and even just like building those repositories that I think can be automated, and there's like smart ways to go about doing that that I'm excited for the innovation that's happening there.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts. And yeah, I think the SME collaboration piece, fighting conflicting content, stale content, I think these are some of the biggest challenges that we are also hearing from our customers. So totally makes sense. I wanted to zoom out a little,
Yeah.
Tejas, and talk about some of the like the industry or the space in general. So there's so much going on right now. How do you see the current landscape of AI-based tools for sales, pre-sales, and go-to-market teams?
Yeah, I mean, if what we saw from OpenAI around GPT 4.0 and with Project Astra and all this stuff, I mean, it's just mind blowing, right? How fast the pace of innovation is, and also what the possibilities are. So I'm excited to see kind of how we start to leverage this technology. I think a few, I think there's like you know, there's like how do we make the processes that exist more efficient? And I think we'll see a lot of that. I mean, you guys are innovating in that space, and I think a lot of this tech will help with that. Um, and there's a bunch of like clerical stuff that I think hopefully will go away as a result of some of these technologies. Like the classic example is just like keeping CRM data up to date, or even simple things like I talked about that logging those product feature gaps and things like that. Like, wouldn't it be great if I could just type a sentence and like that automatically gets gets logged, right? Um, and so I think that that's maybe where we'll see the first layer of innovation happening. Then I think that how do you start to just make um, bring that knowledge into the sales process, like in a just-in-time way throughout the sales process is really interesting. Like, I remember like as an SE in the field, right? You're always looking for answers to questions in a very timely way. And the best thing we've had before was like, hey, I can go ping a friend and hopefully they're looking at their Slack or whatever and I can get a response, right? But now I could have this whole bunch of information at my fingertips, literally like in a meeting, I can be, pulling some of that information up. And again, the accuracy of that is super important. So like making sure that the content is grounded well and like has um, the right level of accuracy is important because we don't want to be eroding our credibility. Um, and then I think it's like how do we start to change the way that like for example, can we change the way that we think about demos and can you have demos that are generated on a very specific, based on a very specific goal that the customer is trying? Obviously, again, it needs to be accurate, or even like fairly straightforward things like generating useful and interesting demo data. I think is it's always been a challenge, and now that you could do that a lot easier. Um, Things like automating setup and takedown of demo environments, I think, is interesting. Like there's just these steps that were overhead that I think can can start to be reduced. And I think about it like from a leadership standpoint, it's a super powerful coaching tool. I think for like
Hmm.
how do you because like we would run simulations, right? We would do kind of mock sessions where an SE or a rep or whoever would present something and we would evaluate it, and that's important. But also having this type of tool to be able to kind of coach somebody along is cool. So yeah, I mean, I'm excited about like where this can go, and as it evolves, I think it'll get much more interesting. But um, I mean, the possibilities are really exciting.
Yeah, yeah. I worked on like some of the earliest LLMs at Google, like back in 2018, 2019. And it's been just like hard for me to keep track of like WTF,
Yeah,
like everything that's happening. So yeah, but I'm like super excited. The opportunity in front of us is like incredible.
yeah.
And this space is going to change so much in like next 3 to 5 years. Like can't even imagine, I would guess.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's fun, exciting times we live in for sure.
Yeah. So at this point, everyone is racing to add AI to their stack. What advice would you give to leaders in sales, solution engineering today?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's embrace it and try to figure out a way to weave that into what you're doing in the organization. And so like letting people experiment with it, within limits and in lower risk ways, and then starting to build from there. That'll spark new ideas. That'll get people more comfortable with it. And I think SEs in particular, like they're really good at sort of building on ideas. And so I think it'd be a fun exercise. I also think things like hackathons are always good for the solutions teams, and we used to do them fairly regularly to just if there's a new product coming out or whatnot. I think this is no different. But I think what I've found as I've like if you go a level deeper and you start to play around with the APIs and you start to actually look at sort of the knobs that are available, that are not always apparent just on like the front ends that these that OpenAI and others offer. That's when you start to like some of the light bulbs start to go off about what what could be done and also what some of the constraints are, right? And so I think that's important. I think for the builders to understand like what are the actual building blocks that I have to play with, and of course, those are getting better over time, right? Like now the concept of memory being introduced and like, okay, how are we going to use that? Now we've got a new building block. And so I think it's super cool, but you don't necessarily see those things unless you go that next level of depth. So that's what I would seek to do. And in whatever team that I'm leading, I mean, I like doing that stuff and tinkering around with it on my own. And so um, which ultimately, like, I think as the leader of the organization, setting that type of example is,
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. I think, yeah, we have a lot of customers we are talking to who are doing like hackathons, testing out things internally. I think you definitely have to build that culture where people can experiment with
yeah,
things and, see what works.
also
I'm
goes
also
back to
seeing,
the psychological safety, right? It's like you have to create the conditions where people feel comfortable doing those kinds of things.
right, yeah. I'm also seeing the flip side in like some of the organizations. Like today, we talked to a potential customer, and they were telling us they've tried a bunch of things internally, but seems like it's harder than like it's harder to create a functioning product than to create a demo. So yeah, I guess that's like the other, like you have to account for both sides of the equation. Like test it out to know what you want to probably build and figure out what you want to buy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, extracting value from it is a whole different conversation, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's where, a lot of folks are still kind of scratching their heads on how is this actually going to drive value. But I think you don't get to that unless you've actually tried, right? And so I think that's the first step
Exactly.
still.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Awesome. I wanted to maybe switch gears again, Tejas, and learn a little bit about you personally and like your leadership philosophy and that type of thing. So maybe to start, kick that off, like what's the best lesson or takeaway you have learned through your career?
Yeah. Your viewership and listenership's going to drop, Gaurav. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, I think uh, yeah, my takeaway from my career, I think, yeah, I said some of it at the beginning. I think, like, ultimately, it's go work on interesting problems and with interesting technology, with interesting people, right? Like, those are the things that I've tried to use to guide me. I will say one of the big things I'm learning a lot about is, especially as a leader of an organization, it is how do I make sure that my organization and the great work that all the people that are doing in my team is being recognized fully, and also like everybody has a different form of recognition that they care about that resonates with them. So recognition doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. It doesn't mean, hey, that like they wanted to be highlighted in the all hands, right? It's like some people that's not what they want as recognition. And so I think just learning that on an individual basis is really, really important. And then me as the leader trying to find the ways to create those opportunities. Probably one thing that is kind of top of mind for me right now. But um, And then the other big thing, like I'm a big believer in this. I don't know if you've heard of this career jungle gym metaphor versus career ladder metaphor, but it's, you know, a ladder is like you're going up and there's like a very clear progression within a functional area or something. And for me, it's my career has looked very different, and I actually think it's a lot of fun to be able to go,
Hmm.
more like a jungle gym where you're going off to the side. Sometimes you might even be going down a rung so you can get to the next rung, right? And so I think that metaphor works really well because what I'm really thinking about is like I'm pursuing skills, I'm pursuing opportunities that may not be linear and the path may not be obvious. But at the end of the day, like I'm collecting a lot of these different perspectives along the way. So that's how I've thought about my career.
That's awesome. I never heard of this jungle gym phrase, but yeah, I totally see that makes such a like it's so obvious essentially. Like a lot of our careers are not just like climbing the same ladder. You're going in, trying out something else, getting stronger at that, learning that. So totally makes sense.
Yeah.
What would you say are your like top books? What would you say like in terms of top books that you would recommend for salespeople? It could be for non-salespeople. It could be
Yeah.
non-work related.
Yeah, well, as you can see from my background here, I like to read. I pretty much
Mhm.
exclusively read nonfiction, like business types of books, which I know sounds really boring, but it's really fascinating for me. And not just sales related, but also like lately it's been a lot of just behavioral psychology stuff. And so one of the books I read recently, which was really fascinating, is Nudge. And Nudge talks about, essentially like small changes in the way we present information or the way that we,
Mm.
talk to people can actually have really big impact on their behavior. So that's one that's been really interesting. I'm currently reading a book called Edge, and Edge is about how do you find your personal, how do you like think about your personal narrative in a way that is differentiated and therefore creates an edge for you. And so that book is it's pretty it's a really I think especially for people who sort of have a background that is non-traditional or I mean everyone's faced some sort of challenge or adversity in their life and like how do you turn that adversity into something that's really
Mm.
powerful because ultimately those are the things that have shaped you and um, so that's been a good read right now but yeah those are kind of the category of books that
Got
I've
it.
been reading of late.
Is Nudge by Richard Thaler? Is that the one?
I think that sounds right. I should know these authors.
Got it. Yeah, we'll link it on the show notes. So I was just checking for that.
Yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, I think I just wanted to like open it up if there is anything else that you wanted to share, any general advice before we close.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other advice we don't talk enough about it, especially in the technology industry. We are often in positions that we can give back, and so for me, that's a really important part of what I try to do. Is I'm on the board of a nonprofit called Abode.org, and they're a Bay Area nonprofit that builds permanent supportive housing for the homeless, which is obviously a really hard and important problem that we're facing, especially in California. But um, it's a really rewarding on multiple levels. I get to work with an amazingly dedicated team at the nonprofit. They're really, really passionate about what they do. And in the board, I'm primarily there to ask good questions and provide my perspectives, right? They're doing the hard work, but it is very fulfilling to be part of that. And just recently we had a grand opening of a building in Santa Clara that it's got 80 units, I think, and so those are I think half of those are earmarked for previously homeless folks, and the other half is all low income or is supportive housing, and so you know, that's the kind of stuff that at the end of the day, it's like a really, really important and hard problem to go work on. And doing it in this way has been really, um, it has been really fun.
That's awesome. Love it. It's called Abode again, A
Abode,
B O
yeah,
D E, abode.org.
abode.org. Yep. Yeah,
Awesome,
check it
awesome.
out.
Yeah, great to know about that, Tejas.
Yeah.
Cool. That's all from my side, Tejas. It was great chatting with you. I got a lot of lovely and like a lot of useful insights. I've like posted full of notes that
Nice.
I think we're gonna also distill down into smaller chunks so people can consume them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for making time.
Yeah. Thanks, Gaurav. Thanks for having me, and appreciate everything you guys are doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Tejas.
Yeah.